I sat by the window in the cafe, 2 cups of Americano placed in front of me. One remained untouched, while the other was picked up by the woman across from me, who took a gentle sip. Her name was Annie, and she was once my wife. However, in about 10 minutes, to be precise, she would become my ex-wife. Annie set down her coffee cup, the base clinking crisply against the tabletop. Her tone was flat, as if she were discussing the weather, as she said, "Julian, let's get a divorce." As she spoke, she didn't even glance at me, her fingers swiping across her phone screen. I knew exactly who she was likely replying to. Thinking back to my previous life, when I first heard those words, my mind went completely blank. I remember my hands trembling uncontrollably, coffee spilling onto my pants, the scalding liquid leaving a large red mark. I instinctively grabbed her wrist, my voice trembling as I said, "Annie, did I do something wrong? Tell me, and I'll definitely change." However, she coldly withdrew her hand, gently smoothing the wrinkled sleeve I had gripped, and frowned as she said, "You didn't do anything wrong. It's just that I don't love you anymore." At that moment, my heart felt as if it had been pierced by countless needles. Afterward, I knelt at the entrance of her apartment like a soulless puppet for 3 whole days and nights. My knees pressed against the cold corridor tiles, each minute and second as painful as a knife cutting through me, leaving 2 deep bruises on my kneecaps in the end. But she merely slipped a note through the crack of the door, which read, "Stop making a scene, it's embarrassing." These words, I will never forget in this lifetime, or to be precise, I've remembered them for 2 lifetimes. "Julian." Annie's voice pulled me back from the painful memories. She finally looked up, her brows slightly furrowed, as if puzzled by my sudden silence. I quietly watched her, this face that I once knew so well. The arched eyebrows, the thin lips, the small mole at the corner of her eye, once, in my eyes, this was the most beautiful face in the world. For her, I worked tirelessly after marriage, handing over every penny I earned. If she wanted a bag from a certain brand, I would work overtime until 3 in the morning to finish a proposal. When she said her mother was hospitalized and needed money, I didn't hesitate to max out my credit card. But later, I found out that the money had been transferred to Axel to pay off his gambling debts. And that child, the one I always believed was my own flesh and blood, turned out to be Axel's. In my past life, I didn't discover this truth until the child was 6 years old. That day, Annie's phone was unlocked, and I saw a message she had sent, "Honey, the child looks more and more like you." The sender was none other than Axel. At that moment, my world collapsed. I felt as if I had been struck by lightning, sitting there in a daze, followed by a whole night of vomiting blood, a pain so intense it felt like my stomach was cramping and my esophagus was tearing. "Julian, are you even listening to me?" Annie's voice carried a hint of impatience. I lowered my head, looking at the divorce agreement on the table. The black and white text was clear and straightforward. In the section for property division, she had explicitly written, "The husband voluntarily waives all marital joint property." In my previous life, I signed without any resistance, leaving with nothing, not taking a single penny. Because she said, "If you make a fuss, I won't let you see the child." At the time, I chose to compromise just to be able to see the child. But later, I realized that the child wasn't even mine. Memories flooded back like a tide, a sharp pain throbbed at my temples, and the memories of my past life pierced my mind like shards of glass. The final scenes before my death flashed before my eyes again and again, the blinding white light in the hospital corridor, the beeping of the heart monitor growing slower and slower, the nurse shouting something beside me, but I couldn't make out a single word. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and when I opened them again, Annie across from me was looking down at me with a gaze full of pity, as if she were looking at a kicked dog, making sure it wouldn't bite before confidently giving it another kick. I picked up the pen on the table. Annie clearly froze for a moment, she probably didn't expect me to be so straightforward. In my past life, I had cried and begged for 3 days before signing this agreement. The pen tip touched the paper, and I smoothly signed my name, Julian, with firm and powerful strokes. I pushed the agreement back to her, screwed the cap back on the pen, gently placed it on the table, and calmly said, "It's signed." Annie's mouth slightly opened, her hand holding the phone paused mid-air. She stared at the signature for a full 5 seconds before looking up, her eyes now carrying a hint of confusion, an expression I had never seen in my previous life. Hesitantly, she asked, "You aren't going to try to stop this?" I picked up the untouched Americano in front of me and took a gentle sip. The coffee had already gone cold, carrying a burnt, bitter taste. Setting the cup down, I said calmly, "I can let the matter of the child go." My voice wasn't loud, but it exploded like a bomb in Annie's heart. Her face instantly turned deathly pale, devoid of any color, her lips turning a grayish purple. Her fingers clenched tightly around her phone case, her knuckles turning white. Her voice trembled as she asked, What did you say?" I didn't answer her again. I stood up, took some money from my pocket, placed it on the table to pay the cafe bill, then turned and walked away. Behind me came the sound of chair legs scraping against the floor. I knew she had stood up. "Julian," she called out loudly, a hint of panic in her voice. I didn't look back, pushing open the glass door directly. The outside air rushed in, carrying the dry heat of late September. The glass door slowly closed behind me, cutting off her voice. I stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the clear blue sky. In my past life, I never thought the sky could be so blue, perhaps because back then, my heart was filled with pain and despair, leaving no room to appreciate such beauty. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a text message from Annie. "What exactly do you know?" 2 question marks, revealing her panic. In my past life, she would never have spoken to me in such a tone. She always communicated with certainty and authority, leaving no room for me to argue. I stared at it for 3 seconds, then deleted the message without hesitation. Next, I opened my contacts and scrolled to a name that had almost sunk to the bottom, Christopher. In my previous life, Christopher was my biggest client. Later, Annie and Axel teamed up to poach him from me, which became the final straw that crushed my company. But now, things are different. I remember the news reports from my past life. 17 days from now, at 3 p.m. on September 15th, Christopher's son Vincent would be involved in a multi-vehicle pileup at the 72-kilometer mark of the G56 expressway's Ningyuan section. Although he would survive, it would be a close brush with death. I pressed the dial button, and Christopher's voice soon came through on the other end. "Hello, who is this?" "Mr. Christopher, this is Julian. There's something I must discuss with you in person." There was a 2-second silence on the other end of the line, then the voice asked, "What is it?" "It's about your son." Another silence followed, this time longer. "Go on." I hung up the phone and raised my hand to hail a taxi. After getting in, I glanced at the coffee shop behind me through the rearview mirror. Through the glass door, I saw Annie standing in place, phone held to her ear, making a call. I know who she's calling. It must be Axel. She's probably anxiously asking, does he know something? And Axel will surely scoff and say, impossible. He's just a useless piece of trash, trying to scare you. Ignore him. Let them think whatever they want, they still have 17 peaceful days left. The taxi merged into the traffic, and the cafe gradually disappeared in the rearview mirror. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes. 2 timelines kept intertwining in my mind, the me from my past life, kneeling humbly on the corridor tiles, my knees bloodied, the me in this life, decisively signing the papers without a moment's hesitation. The same person, standing at the same crossroads in life, yet making completely different choices. Christopher runs a building materials company in the east of the city. While it may not be a top-tier enterprise locally, he has extensive connections and holds supply contracts for 3 major real estate projects. In his previous life, when Christopher's son Vincent was in a car accident, he was frantic and desperate, cutting off all ties to search for connections throughout the city to save him. Whoever could help, he regarded as a benefactor. It was at that time that Axel seized the opportunity to get involved. He helped Christopher contact experts from the provincial capital and, from then on, acted as if he were the savior, taking control of Christopher's building material supply channels for himself. I clearly remember the news report about that car accident in my previous life. On September 15th, at 3 p.m., a chain reaction collision occurred at the 72-kilometer mark of the Ningyuan section of the G56 expressway. Vincent's white BMW was sandwiched between 2 trucks, its front end severely crushed, almost flattened into a pancake. When the firefighters rescued him from the car using hydraulic cutters, he was still breathing, but he had 4 broken ribs and a lung contusion. He spent 2 full months in the ICU. Today is August 29th, 17 days away from that car accident. When I arrived at Christopher's company, he was leisurely brewing tea in his office. He was a middle-aged man in his early 50s, with a crew cut. Due to years of socializing, his face carried a hint of alcohol-induced redness, but his eyes were exceptionally bright, as if sizing someone up when he looked at them. "Julian," he said, holding his teacup without standing up, his tone indifferent. "It's been a while since we last spoke. You mentioned something about my son." His tone wasn't particularly warm, but it wasn't deliberately distant either. I knew he still remembered me. 3 years ago, I had supplied him with a batch of high-quality boards at a reasonable price, and he had praised me as a reliable young man. However, in his world, I was just a small supplier. Although I could speak with him, I wasn't important enough for him to stand up and greet me. "Mr. Christopher," I sat down without touching the tea he offered and got straight to the point. "I'll be direct. Your son Vincent, has he been taking the G56 highway frequently lately?" Christopher's hand holding the tea paused slightly as he asked, "How did you know?" "He's been working on a new construction project in Nguyen and makes the trip at least twice a week." His eyes narrowed slightly, clearly surprised that I could know this with such accuracy. After all, while this information wasn't highly confidential, it was still unusual for a small supplier to be so well informed. At the 72-kilometer mark of the G56 Nguyen section, there's a downhill curve where the guardrail was damaged by a truck last year and still hasn't been repaired. What's more, overloaded trucks are a serious problem on that stretch. Traffic authorities have conducted several inspections, but with little effect. A friend of mine in the highway traffic police mentioned it to me, saying that sooner or later, something major is bound to happen there. I said unhurriedly. Actually, part of this information came from accident analysis reports I had seen in my previous life, and the other part was what I had looked up on my phone while in the taxi. The complaint records about the damaged guardrail are posted on the municipal website, they're public information. I simply connected these publicly available pieces of information in a reasonable way to form a targeted reminder. Christopher stared at me for a long time before asking, "You came all the way here just to tell me this?" "Mr. Christopher, I don't mean anything else by it," I stood up and said sincerely. "I just wanted to give you a simple heads up. If you think I'm meddling in something that's none of my business, just pretend I was never here." I turned and walked 3 steps away when Christopher suddenly said, "Wait." He set down his teacup and stood up. It was the first time he had stood up today. "You." He looked at me, his eyes seeming to reassess me. "Even when doing business with you, I felt you didn't seem like a pure businessman." "I am a pure businessman," I replied. A pure businessman wouldn't travel all the way here to remind someone with little connection to watch out for their safety. He walked up to me and patted my shoulder. "I'll remember this favor. I'll have Vincent avoid that route from now on." I nodded, and before leaving, I glanced back at him and said, "Mr. Christopher, if anyone comes to discuss a partnership for building materials channels with you recently, please keep an eye out for me. I have a proposal I'd like to show you in a few days." Christopher smiled and said, "All right. Let's see your proposal first." Walking out of Christopher's office, I stood in the hallway and took a deep breath. In my past life, Christopher only became deeply grateful to Axel after Vincent's accident. But in this life, I warned him in advance, so Vincent likely won't have an accident, and Axel's path has been cut off. The connection between Christopher and me has only just begun. Back at the rental apartment, this is the place I moved to after the divorce, located in an urban village, a small room costing 800 yuan a month. Next door lives a middle-aged couple who often argue. The walls are thin, and I can clearly hear the sound of them smashing bowls. In my previous life, I lived in this room for 3 months until the company completely went bankrupt, after which I moved to a cheaper basement. I sat on the edge of the bed, took out my phone, and opened my social media feed. I took a photo of a cup of instant noodles on the table, with peeling paint on the wall and yellowed curtains in the background. I posted the photo without any caption. 3 minutes later, Annie's close friend Nix liked it. 5 minutes later, Elara also liked it. 8 minutes later, Nix commented, "Julian, take care of yourself. Even when you're alone, make sure to eat well." But I know all too well. In my past life, she had shared this screenshot in her group chat with her girlfriends, captioning it, "Look at your ex-husband, eating instant noodles after leaving you, ha 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 ha." Annie's reply was, "Serves him right. What could he have done by not signing back then?" I waited for 12 minutes, and sure enough, Annie's private message arrived, "I saw what you posted. Why live like this?" Her tone was filled with a sense of superiority, as if she were bestowing charity upon a beggar, laced with a condescending pity. I only replied with one word, Then I locked the screen. It's better to let her think I'm barely hanging on. The more she sees me as pathetic, the less she'll be on guard. If she's not on guard, Axel will act sooner, and the sooner he acts, the better it is for me. I rummaged through the drawer of the bedside table and pulled out an old notebook, spreading it open on my knees. Starting today, I'm going to write down every key time point I remember from my past life. September 15th, Vincent's car accident prevented. October 3rd, Axel's company signs a dual contract with Bin Hai Real Estate, smuggling building materials, with a discrepancy of 12 million on the books. October 10, Annie transfers 35% of the company's equity to a shell company under her name by forging my signature. October 15, Axel lured Charles with the bait of a 3-year exclusive contract for the advertising company. November 1, my company's funding chain broke, and I filed for bankruptcy. In my past life, these events were like sharp knives, stabbing at me again and again. I thought it was fate being unfair to me. It wasn't until the moment before my death, lying on the hospital bed, that I finally understood, it wasn't fate being unfair, but everyone around me deliberately setting me up, and I foolishly handed them the knives. But now it's different. The initiative of fate is in my hands. Those who have hurt me will pay the price. I closed the notebook, my eyes firm and filled with determination. Charles was a good friend of mine from my university days. He had a face that looked a bit rough around the edges, but he was an incredibly loyal and righteous person. During our 4 years in university, there was one time when I was cornered by some upperclassmen in the small woods behind the sports field. The leader of the group was about 1.85 meters tall and was holding half a brick in his hand. There were 4 of them in total, and they were picking a fight with me over a girl I hadn't even glanced at. Just when I was completely helpless, Charles showed up. He was munching on a meat pie at the time, and when he saw what was happening, without saying a word, he stuffed the pie into his pocket, rushed over, and punched the guy right in the face. The guy immediately flew into a rage and swung the brick back, hitting Charles on his left shoulder. Blood started gushing out instantly. Later, he had to go to the hospital and got 8 stitches, leaving a deep scar behind. Afterwards, I asked him, "You're not even in the same field as me, so why did you take the hit for me?" He pulled the meat pie out of his pocket, patted off the dust, and said while munching, "I just didn't like the look of those 4 guys." Such a simple sentence, yet it filled my heart with warmth. However, in my past life, I let him down. When Axel tried to win him over with an exclusive 3-year advertising contract, his ad agency was already on the verge of collapse, his wife was threatening divorce, and he couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. At that time, I was also trapped in my own troubles, too overwhelmed to even offer him a word of comfort. But in this life, I won't let such a thing happen again. I must make up for the debt I owed him in my past life. On Wednesday evening, I arranged to meet Charles at the barbecue stall near the university town that we used to frequent during our student days. Although the owner had changed 3 times, the grill was still under the phoenix tree at the street corner, unchanged. When Charles arrived, he had already had a few drinks. His eyes were slightly red, his tie hung loosely around his neck, and his shirt cuffs were rolled up to his forearms. "Buddy," he plopped down with a grin and said, "You invited me for barbecue? Are you that happy about getting divorced?" "Who told you that?" I asked. "Yes. Annie's best friend. That one named Alara, she was being all shady and sarcastic in her social media posts. I guessed it right away." As he spoke, he ordered 20 skewers of lamb and a dozen beers, then tapped the edge of the table with his chopsticks, urging, "Go on, what happened? Did she find someone else?" I looked at him, the dim yellow light from the barbecue stall spilling over his face, the shadows of the plane tree leaves swaying across it. I remembered that in my past life, at this time, he was still on my side, but in another month and a half, Axel would come looking for him. "Charles," I said softly. He looked up at me. "Is that scar on your left shoulder still there?" I asked. Charles was taken aback for a moment, the beer bottle in his hand pausing at his lips. A flicker of memory passed through his eyes as he asked in return, "Why bring that up all of a sudden?" "During our junior year, behind the sports field, 4 guys cornered me. You were passing by, munching on a meat pie, took one look, and charged in. One of them smashed a brick against your shoulder, it took 8 stitches." I recounted calmly, but as soon as the words left my mouth, Charles's eyes welled up with tears. "Are you drunk?" He tilted his head back and took a swig of beer, saying, "Why bring this up?" "I'm not drunk." I stared into his eyes and said earnestly, "Because I owe you. I've never paid it back." Charles set down the bottle and stared at me for a long time. The greasy smoke from the barbecue stall swirled between us, stinging our eyes. "Julian, don't make it sound like a last will," he said, his voice a bit hoarse. "It's just a divorce, not the end of the world. The sky hasn't fallen." I smiled. "It's dawn." He didn't understand my words, but that didn't matter. "Charles, how has your company been lately?" I asked. His expression instantly darkened. He set the wine glass in his hand on the table, his thumb rubbing back and forth over the label on the bottle. With a bitter smile, he said, "Same as always, no, worse than usual. The mortgage payment is due at the end of the month, and my wife argues with me every day. Last week, a client who owed me the final payment for 3 months, $120,000, stopped answering my calls and replying to my messages." He gave a helpless, bitter smile and continued, "What a mess this is." "What's the client's name?" I pressed. "Oliver. He runs a chain of restaurants," he replied. I nodded. I remembered Oliver. In my past life, after Charles's company went bankrupt, I had come across that name while going through his account books. Oliver was the client with the largest outstanding debt. Later, in late October, his restaurant chain was investigated for food safety issues and ended up losing everything. "Give me 2 days," I said. "I'll help you with this." Charles looked at me, his eyes filled with doubt. "You're even eating instant noodles yourself. How can you help me?" "Instant noodles are delicious," I replied with a smile. He stared at me for a long time, then suddenly burst into laughter. As he laughed, his eyes turned red again. He picked up his beer bottle and clinked it against mine. "It's been over 10 years, and you're the only one who's ever said to me, 'I'll help you with this,' without asking for anything in return." I clinked glasses with him too, the beer sliding down my throat, bitter and cold. "Charles," I said solemnly. He looked at me. "Over the next month, someone might come to you. They'll offer you some very tempting terms, asking you to make certain choices." Charles's smile vanished as he retorted, "Who?" "You'll find out when the time comes." I looked into his eyes and said earnestly, "I'll just tell you one thing, no matter what price he offers you, don't agree to it." "What exactly are you up to?" He was somewhat baffled. "Playing chess." I pushed the last skewer of lamb toward him. "You're not a pawn, you're on my side." Charles slowly chewed on the lamb skewer, taking a long time before swallowing it. Then he wiped his mouth and said firmly, "All right." Although it was just a simple word, I saw a sense of trust and determination in his eyes, a look I never saw again in my previous life. In this lifetime, I will cherish this trust. On the way back to the rental apartment, I received a message from Annie in the group chat with her close friends. She didn't know I hadn't left the group yet. Annie said, "The divorce agreement is signed." He didn't say a word, which went smoother than I expected. Axel was right, he's just a spineless loser. The next step is to move quickly on the equity side before he realizes what's happening. Elara replied, "Let's get this over with quickly. By the way, did you see his social media post? Eating instant noodles, hahaha, it's hilarious." Nick said, stop laughing, it's kind of pitiful, haha." Annie said, "Pitiful? If he had any ability, I wouldn't have divorced him." "Forget it, let's not talk about it. Axel has scheduled a meeting with a lawyer tomorrow to handle the company's legal representative change first." I saved screenshots of these conversations, marked the dates, and then exited the group chat. Looking at these screenshots, I sneered inwardly. They thought I was still the fool they could manipulate at will, but they had no idea I had already set up an inescapable trap. On the afternoon of September 14th at 2 o'clock, Christopher called. "Julian, I had someone check that stretch of road you mentioned last time. The guardrail is indeed broken, the road markings are completely worn away, and there's not even a reflective marker on the outside of the curve. Yesterday, I stopped Vincent from taking that road, and today there was a 3-truck pileup right there." I gripped the phone tightly, my palms sweating. Although Vincent was fine, an accident still happened, but it proved that my warning was correct. Christopher was silent for a moment on the other end of the line, then said, "I've lived for over 50 years and never believed in any sixth sense. But you, kid," he paused for 2 seconds before continuing, "come to my office tomorrow. I'll take a look at that proposal of yours." "All right," I agreed. After hanging up, I stood by the window, gazing at the sliver of sky visible between the narrow alleys of the urban village. A ray of sunlight happened to pierce through the gap, falling on a red bedsheet drying on the balcony opposite. On this day in my previous life, Vincent was still struggling painfully in the ICU bed, but in this life, he should be leisurely playing games at home. Just one reminder from me changed his fate and also earned me an opportunity. On September 20th, the autumn cocktail party of the East City Chamber of Commerce was held in the banquet hall of the Bin Hai Grand Hotel. The crystal chandeliers here were dazzling, the red carpet covered the floor, and waiters carrying champagne weaved through the crowd. The banquet hall was filled with many small and medium-sized business owners from the city, chatting in small groups, their smiles hiding calculations about business. I arrived at the cocktail party wearing the only decent navy blue suit jacket from my rented apartment's wardrobe. The receptionist at the entrance glanced at my invitation, looked me up and down, hesitated for a moment, but ultimately let me in. I took a glass of sparkling water in the corner and stood next to a potted plant. In my previous life, I had also attended this cocktail party, but back then, I was just an accessory to Annie, following behind her, carrying her bag, handing her drinks, and shielding her from social obligations. She always introduced me to others with a dismissive tone, saying, "This is my husband, he's in the building materials business." Her voice was filled with contempt, as if I were just an accessory she carried around. "Julian." A voice called from the front. I turned and saw Annie. She was wearing a black gown, her hair was elegantly styled, and she had a pair of diamond earrings I had never seen before. Standing beside her was Axel, who was half a head taller than me. He wore a green Rolex Submariner, a custom-tailored suit, and a tie clip adorned with a small diamond. His hand rested lightly on Annie's waist, the very spot where I used to stand. "Isn't this Julian?" Annie said with feigned surprise, her tone dripping with superiority. "You're here too? Who invited you?" Axel glanced at me, his gaze sweeping from the top of my head down to my feet. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly, not a friendly smile, but one of disdainful judgment. "Julian, right?" Axel held a wine glass in one hand, the other tucked into his pants pocket, speaking with an air of arrogance. "Annie mentioned you. In the building materials business?" His tone made it sound as if he were referring to a cheap commodity. "Used to be," I replied calmly. "Used to be," Axel repeated with a cold laugh. "And now?" As soon as he finished speaking, a few people gathered around. They were all local small business owners who had caught a whiff of gossip and came over to join in. Annie's close friend Alara was also in the crowd, wearing a sequin dress and holding a martini, her eyes darting back and forth between Annie and me. "Julian, you're in the startup phase right now," Annie chimed in, her tone carrying a condescending understanding. "You just got divorced, and there are a lot of things you need to start over with." She glanced back at Axel, and the two exchanged a knowing smile. Alara added fuel to the fire beside them, saying, "Julian, living alone, you should take care of your health. Don't eat instant noodles every day." The people around burst into laughter. Though the laughter wasn't loud, every note felt like a needle pricking at me. In my past life, such laughter would have filled me with insecurity and pain, but now, I felt an unusual calm, because I no longer cared about their opinions. "Mr. Julian." A resonant voice, brimming with undeniable authority, came from behind the crowd. Everyone's gaze shifted toward the source, it was Christopher. He was dressed in a grey checkered suit, holding no wine glass in hand. With steady strides, he made his way through the crowd, heading straight toward me. Those around instinctively cleared a path for him. "Mr. Christopher." Ilara's hand trembled, nearly spilling her martini. Christopher ranked among the top 10 in the city's Chamber of Commerce, a prominent and influential figure. His attendance at this cocktail party alone made the invitation at the entrance exceptionally valuable. He stopped before me, extending his hand and saying, "Julian, I've reviewed the proposal you mentioned to me last time." His voice was loud and clear, audible to everyone present. "The supply chain integration plan for that plot in the new district, your approach is well chosen. Come to my office next Monday, and we'll discuss it in detail." After speaking, he patted my shoulder. Though the pat was moderate in strength, the recognition it conveyed was clear to everyone. The banquet hall fell silent for 2 seconds. Ilara was so shocked she couldn't close her mouth, and the condensation on Axel's wine glass grew thicker as his fingers unconsciously tightened. As for Annie, she watched as Christopher's hand left my shoulder, then looked at me, her lips moving but no sound coming out. The diamond earrings shimmered under the light, as if mocking her astonishment. I nodded at Christopher and said, "All right. See you on Monday." After Christopher left, the atmosphere around me instantly shifted. The bosses who had previously ignored me now gathered around. "Julian, where have you been working before? Julian, can you bring us into Christopher's project?" I politely dealt with them, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw Annie and Axel still standing there, motionless. Axel leaned in and whispered something into Annie's ear, and Annie shook her head. Then she picked up a glass of wine, pretending to be calm as she walked toward another group of people, but I could tell her steps were a bit flustered. The sound of her high heels on the marble floor was heavy on the left foot and light on the right. She was clearly nervous. I finished my sparkling water, placed it on the waiter's tray, and turned to leave the banquet hall. Stepping out of the hotel entrance, the night wind rushed into my collar, and I unbuttoned the top button of my suit. My phone rang. It was a message from Charles, bro, that Oliver just transferred the final payment. Said he got a call from the tax office checking his accounts and was so scared he settled it the same day. How did you do it? I didn't reply to him. In fact, in my previous life, Charles had already told me that Oliver would be investigated for tax issues at the end of October, and the source of the trouble was someone reporting him as early as the beginning of September. I simply sent an anonymous report to the relevant authorities ahead of time. The information in the letter was all data Charles had mentioned to me while complaining after drinking in my previous life. These were all publicly available details. I just used legal channels to act earlier. I put away my phone and stepped into the late September night. Behind me, the hotel was brightly lit, with the sounds of clinking glasses and lively chatter drifting out, while ahead, streetlights stretched one after another into the distance. In my previous life, I had walked this same road, but it was a path leading to an abyss. In this life, though the road remains the same, the person walking it has been reborn. I believe I can now forge a bright and promising path forward. On the third day after the cocktail party, Axel couldn't sit still any longer and began to take action. Christopher's office received a phone call from Alexander, the vice president of the city's Construction Industry Association. Alexander had a deep friendship with Christopher, spanning 20 years, but he was also a fellow townsman of Axel's father. Christopher, how much do you know about that Julian? Alexander's voice was unhurried. I heard he just got divorced and his company is no longer operating. People are saying all sorts of things about you partnering with someone like that. What are they saying? Christopher asked. They say you were easily swayed by a young man's words, Alexander said with a laugh. I'm just worried about you. You know Axel, right? He's in foreign trade and comes from a well-off family. He has a more mature proposal. Why don't you take a look at it too? Christopher didn't respond to his remark and simply hung up the phone, then turned around and called me. Someone is pulling strings behind the scenes, Christopher said straight to the point. Leaning back in the chair of my rented apartment, I listened to his words without the slightest change in the corner of my mouth. Everything was within my expectations. In my previous life, Axel used the favor he owed Vincent after the car accident as a stepping stone to collaborate with Christopher, but now that path was blocked. He could only rely on his connections to put pressure on me. Mr. Christopher, I just have one question for you, I said. Go ahead. Is Vincent doing okay now? There was a 3-second silence on the other end of the phone. That stretch of road you mentioned, I looked into the rear-end collision that day. It was a 3-truck pileup. If Vincent had been on that road, he would have been sandwiched in the middle. Christopher's voice grew low. You saved my son's life. Even if Alexander made 100 calls, I wouldn't turn around and partner with someone else. Then just ignore him, I said. Let him stir things up. Aren't you worried? I'm not worried. Why? Because he has no cards left to play. He thinks I have nothing, but precisely because he thinks that way, he'll be completely off guard. Christopher smiled and said, all right. I'd like to see what tricks he can still pull off. Meanwhile, Annie wasn't idle either. The fact that Christopher publicly discussed cooperation with me at the cocktail party deeply wounded her pride. She did something she hadn't done in her previous life. She sent Elara to check my recent bank transactions. Elara's cousin works as a bank teller and has solid connections. 3 days later, Elara took a photo of a printed transaction record and sent it to Annie. Annie, look. He only has $37,000 left in his account. Last month's deposits were 0. Annie looked at the photo, placed her phone on the table, leaned back into the sofa, and smiled triumphantly. I knew it. She sent a message to Axel, he's pretending. He only has a little over $30,000 in his account. Christopher is probably someone he managed to latch onto somehow, but he has no real money. No need to worry. Axel quickly replied, I told you. He's just a blustering coward. Speed things up, get the legal representative change done by next week. Annie, okay. By the way, the suit he wore at the reception looked familiar to me. It seemed to be the one I bought for him before we got married. He's still wearing it after 3 years. Axel replied, ha 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 ha. All right, stop thinking about him. I'll take you to see that Riverside apartment tomorrow. I was unaware of these conversations, but in truth, I didn't need to know. Because at this point in my previous life, they were doing exactly the same things, checking my bank statements, confirming I was broke, and then speeding up the asset transfers. I deliberately left only $37,000 in that card, while the real money, the $500,000 from Christopher's advance payment for the project consultancy fee, was deposited in another card. This card was newly opened in the first week after my rebirth, and Annie had no idea it even existed. In my past life, I was too foolish, telling my wife all my bank card passwords. In this life, I have learned to protect myself and to separate accounts. On Thursday afternoon, Axel took a lawyer to my former company, Xingyuan Building Materials. The company was not large, with a registered capital of $5 million and an actual valuation of just over $20 million, all considered marital joint property. The divorce agreement stated, the husband voluntarily waives marital joint property. However, from a legal perspective, the validity of this clause is debatable, as the agreement only mentions waiving without specifying a detailed list of assets. In my past life, I didn't understand these legal details. I signed and left, allowing them to transfer the company's legal representative to Annie. In this life, when signing the agreement, I deliberately did not attach a list of assets. This was not an oversight but a carefully left loophole. When Axel's lawyer went to the Industrial and Commercial Bureau to handle the legal representative change, the staff at the window carefully reviewed the materials, then looked up and said, the scope of the joint property involved in this divorce agreement is not specifically listed. Both parties need to be present for confirmation, or a supplementary agreement on property division must be provided. The lawyer was taken aback and asked, didn't it already say, give up everything? What exactly does everything refer to? Does it include company equity? Does it include real estate? Does it include vehicles? All of these need to be clearly listed. Otherwise, we cannot process it, the staff explained. Axel stood in the lobby of the Industrial and Commercial Bureau, his expression gradually darkening. He took out his phone and called Annie. The change can't be processed. We need to find Julian to sign an additional document. Axel said anxiously. Annie's voice came from the other end of the phone. Although I couldn't hear what she was saying, the increasingly stiff line of Axel's jaw told me she was in a bad mood. I know, Axel lowered his voice. Don't rush. He's broke now, just name any price and he'll sign. He hung up the phone, turned, and walked out of the Industrial and Commercial Bureau. The evening wind blew through the gaps in the revolving door, scattering the papers in the folder he was holding. A few pages fluttered to the ground. As he bent down to pick them up, his shirt tightened across his back for a moment. He still didn't know that the loophole in this agreement was something I had intentionally left. He thought I was just careless, just like in my past life. But in my past life, I truly was careless. In this life, I won't let them succeed so easily again. Every single word has been carefully considered. October 3rd, a date etched into my memory, remembered across 2 lifetimes. On this day in my past life, Axel signed a dual contract with Binhai Real Estate. On the surface, it was a standard construction material supply agreement, but behind the scenes, it involved smuggling substandard domestic goods at the price of imported materials, pocketing a price difference of 12 million yuan, all of which flowed into Axel's personal account. This money was later used by him to acquire shares in my company, using my own money to buy out my own business. The irony of it still stings. In my past life, I only discovered this accounting discrepancy during the company's bankruptcy liquidation. At the time, my lawyer told me, with a dual contract like this, if you can obtain the original documents, the other party could at least be charged with tax evasion, and in severe cases, it could even constitute contract fraud. But by then, those crucial documents had long been destroyed, leaving me to swallow the loss in silence. Now, however, things are different. I remember the contract number clearly, I know which accountant handled it, and I recall that the original documents were stored in a safe in the finance office on the 3rd floor of Building B at Axel's company, in the 2nd row of metal cabinets. Memory is my greatest weapon, and I will find a way to bring those physical pieces of evidence back into existence. At 9 a.m. on October 3rd, I mailed a real-name whistleblowing letter. The recipient was the Municipal Tax Inspection Bureau, and the content was straightforward, reporting that Hengchang Trading Company, Limited. Axel's company, was suspected of signing dual contracts to evade taxes. I included the contract numbers, the range of amount discrepancies, and the information of the individuals involved. To me, this information was a known fact that had indeed occurred, but in the eyes of the Tax Inspection Bureau, it was a whistleblowing letter with clear clues and precise direction, sufficient to initiate an investigation. They didn't need to know how I came by this information, they only needed to verify it. And once they investigated, they would undoubtedly uncover issues, because the contracts were real, the accounts were real, and the fund transactions were real. After doing this, I sent a message to Charles, "Are you free at noon?" Hot pot. Charles quickly replied, "Yes. Last time you helped me get back that final payment, I'll treat." 12 minutes later, we were sitting in a small hot pot restaurant in the west of the city. Charles had ordered a full table of tripe and goose intestines, with the spicy pot boiling and steam hitting our faces. "Bro," Charles said, "last time you mentioned that someone might come to me, offering conditions and asking me to make a choice." He looked up at me. "They've shown up." I asked, "Who?" "Axel." Charles placed the blanched tripe into his bowl but didn't eat it right away, instead stirring the dipping sauce. He invited me for coffee and mentioned wanting to collaborate on an advertising project. A 3-year exclusive contract with a guaranteed annual minimum of $500,000. $500,000 was undoubtedly a lifeline for Charles's company, which was on the brink of collapse. I almost agreed. Charles looked up, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. "But you told me that line, no matter what price he offers, don't accept." "So you didn't agree?" I asked. "No. But I didn't refuse either. I said I'd go back and think about it." He looked at me, "What do you want me to do?" I picked up a slice of beef and put it in the pot, saying, "Agree to his offer." Charles's hand froze mid-air as he asked in surprise, "What?" "Agree to cooperate with him. Meet, sign the letter of intent, let him think you're on his side." But you recorded it." I looked at him, speaking earnestly. "Every meeting, every word, all recorded." Charles leaned back in his chair. The steam from the hot pot drifted between us, blurring his expression. After a long pause, he smiled and said, "You're playing a very big game, aren't you?" "Not that big. Just taking back what's owed to me, one thing at a time." I said firmly. "All right." He extended his fist, and I extended mine to bump it. The beef in the pot curled, floated, and then sank again in the boiling broth. On October 6th, the tax inspectors arrived. It was 3 p.m. at Axel's company, located in Building B of the South Industrial Park. The reception area was open, with a row of neatly arranged cubicles behind it. That day, Axel wasn't at the company. He was dining with a few friends at a Japanese restaurant in the east of the city, more precisely, showing off to Annie's circle of close friends. Nix and Alara were both present. Once the legal representative change for Annie's ex-husband's company is finalized next month, all their client resources will be ours. Axel picked up a slice of salmon, dipped it in a bit of wasabi, and put it in his mouth, saying smugly, "Don't worry, I'll get Hingchang trading into the top 5 in this city within 6 months at most." Alara raised her glass with a smile. "Axel is mighty." Nix joined in the laughter, but her gaze inadvertently drifted to the side. A message had just popped up on her phone. A friend had sent it, "Do you know Hingchang Trading? I just saw tax bureau cars parked downstairs at their building." Nix's smile instantly froze, and she quickly flipped her phone face down on the table. At the same moment, Axel's phone rang. The caller ID showed it was the company's finance department. "Julian, the tax bureau is here. They said they want to investigate those contracts we have with Binhai Real Estate. They brought a notice for account adjustment." The voice on the other end trembled noticeably. Axel had a mouthful of wasabi and froze completely. 3 seconds later, he threw the napkin onto the table, pushed his chair back, stood up, and asked loudly, "What? What contract are they investigating?" It's that one." The finance person's voice grew softer and softer. "The one that was split into 2 sets." Axel's face instantly turned deathly pale, as if someone had splashed a basin of cold water over him. He trembled as he asked, "Who reported it?" "I don't know, they didn't say." Axel tightly gripped his phone, his knuckles turning white. He turned to look at the people present. Alara and Nix exchanged glances, completely unaware of what was happening. Annie wasn't there, she had gone for a beauty treatment today. Without saying a word, Axel grabbed his jacket and rushed out. The wooden sliding door of the Japanese restaurant slammed against the frame with a loud bang, bounced back, and hit it again. At that moment, I wasn't on the scene. I was at a roadside stall outside a hot pot restaurant, buying 2 cups of sour plum soup, one for Charles and one for myself. The sour plum soup tasted just right, sweet with a hint of sourness, and ice-cold. My phone screen lit up with a news notification. The city's tax inspection bureau conducted special inspections of multiple enterprises within its jurisdiction today. I put the straw in my mouth, and Charles leaned over to glance at the phone screen, exclaiming in surprise, "Isn't this?" "It has nothing to do with me," I cut him off. He still wanted to ask something. "Let's eat hot pot," I said. Charles looked at me, opened his mouth, but ultimately swallowed his words. He lowered his head and took a sip of the sour plum soup, saying, "It's really sweet." The tax audit investigation into Hengchang trading lasted a full 5 days. During these 5 days, Axel's phone was almost blown up. Suppliers called to ask, "Are you in trouble?" Clients called to inquire, "Can the contract still be fulfilled?" The bank also called to say, "Loan approval may need to be delayed." In my previous life, Axel's company didn't run into problems until the end of the year. By then, he had already swallowed my company, giving him enough funds and confidence to resolve the issues. He simply threw money at the problem to smooth things over. But this life is different. Before he could get his hands on my company's shares, his own company's cash flow dried up first. For him, this is undoubtedly a fatal blow. On October 10th, I received an official notice from the Industrial and Commercial Bureau that Annie's application for a change of legal representative had been rejected. The reason given was disputes over the scope of joint property involved in the divorce agreement, requiring mutual negotiation and confirmation or resolution through judicial channels. On the same day, through a lawyer introduced by Christopher, I submitted an application to the court for the confirmation of ownership of marital joint property, requesting a judicial determination of the equity ownership of Xingyuan Building Materials. After the court accepted the case, the equity was automatically frozen, preventing any unauthorized changes, including by Annie. Her reaction was faster than I had anticipated. At 8 p.m. on October 10th, my phone rang, and the caller ID showed it was Annie. I stared at the screen for 3 seconds. In my past life, this number was like the moon and sixpence to me, the only number I wanted to dial in moments of despair. But now, it was just a string of cold digits. I pressed the reject button. 5 seconds later, a second call came in, and I rejected it again. Then came a third call, which I also rejected. After that, she sent a text message, "Julian, can we talk?" Her tone was much softer than before, without the usual harshness and questioning. It wasn't because she had become kinder, but because she needed my signature to complete the change of the company's legal representative. I drafted a reply, thought about it, then deleted it and typed a few new words, "Talk to my lawyer." I sent it. There was a long silence on the other end. 10 minutes later, a new message arrived, "You've changed." Looking at those words, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a bitter smile, nor a cold one, but a smile of relief. Yes, how could someone who has died once not change? I placed my phone face down on the table and closed my eyes. Memories from my past life flooded my mind like a tide. It was a rainy night in late autumn, and I knelt on the concrete steps outside Annie's apartment building like a man who had lost his soul. Rainwater streamed down my hair, my soaked shirt clung tightly to my body, and I was enveloped in cold and despair. I screamed her name at the top of my lungs for a full hour. The lights were on inside the apartment, and the curtains were tightly drawn. I knew she was inside, and I knew Axel was with her, but I stubbornly remained kneeling. Back then, I naively believed that as long as she turned back, everything could still be salvaged. I could have pretended not to know the child wasn't mine, pretended not to know about her and Axel, and continued being the easygoing, kind-hearted person who was always taken advantage of. But in the end, she never looked back. A sudden sharp pain shot through my temples, a side effect of the flashbacks from my past life. I opened my eyes, reached up, and rubbed my temples. The skin I touched was dry, with no trace of rain. Finally, I came to my senses. In this life, I will never kneel again. I will live for myself. On the afternoon of October 12th, Axel came to see me in person. He stood in the hallway of my rented apartment, wearing a neat suit but with a crooked tie and dark, heavy circles under his eyes. Clearly, he hadn't been sleeping well these past few days. "Julian," he leaned against the wall in the hallway, arms crossed, and said arrogantly, "How much do you want?" I stood at the door, not inviting him in, and asked coldly, "What money?" "The shares. You know what I'm talking about." He took a cigarette out of his pocket, lit it, and took a deep drag. "Name your price, sign the papers, and we can all move on." The smoke he exhaled drifted toward me, making me cough. I know what kind of life you're living now. He glanced down at the cramped, narrow rental room behind me, a mocking smile curling at the corner of his lips. A village in the city, 800 a month. You can hear the neighbors arguing next door, can't you? Why bother? I'll give you $1 million. Sign the papers, take the money, rent a better place, start a small business, it'll be enough for the rest of your life. $1 million. In my past life, he took all my shares for less than 800,000. This time, he's offering an extra 200,000. It seems he's in a hurry. Axel, I said. He blew out a puff of smoke and raised an eyebrow, signaling me to continue. Before you came to see me, did you bother to check on your own company first? I asked calmly. His movements paused, and he asked in confusion, what do you mean? How is the investigation into your company's dual contracts going with the tax authorities? I stared into his eyes, enunciating each word clearly. Axel's cigarette stopped at his lips, no longer being smoked. His eyes narrowed, filled with vigilance and scrutiny, shifting from an initially condescending attitude to one of suspicion. He demanded, how do you know about this? I didn't answer his question. Was that letter of complaint you? He still wanted to press further. I don't know anything about any letter of complaint, I leaned against the doorframe and said coldly. But I suggest you clean up your own mess first before coming to discuss the price with me. A section of ash from Axel's cigarette fell onto his polished leather shoes, but he didn't notice. He stared at me intently for a long time, then crushed the cigarette but fiercely against the wall of the hallway, leaving a black scorch mark. Julian, he lowered his voice and said viciously, do you think you've won? With that, he turned and walked away, his leather shoes making heavy thuds on the concrete floor of the hallway, each step seeming to vent his anger. I stood at the doorway, watching his back disappear around the corner of the stairs, then closed the door. In my previous life, Axel met his misfortune only after completely crushing me, but in this life, before he could take advantage of me, he had already fallen into trouble himself. I walked to the window and pulled back the yellowed curtain. Through the glass, sunlight squeezed through the gap between two buildings, forming a narrow beam that shone directly on my face, warm and comforting. I knew that my new life was about to begin. Time moved to October 20th, and Annie did something I never expected. To be precise, she did this 3 whole months earlier than in my previous life. She actually went and got a paternity test. In my previous life, this happened in January of the following year. At that time, the child needed a physical examination for elementary school, and it was discovered that the blood type didn't match. Only then did Annie reluctantly go for the test. After the results came out, she hid the report tightly and never let me know about it from start to finish. Later, I only found out by chance when I was going through the recycle bin of her phone's cloud photo album. By then, the child was already 6 years old, which means I had been raising this child, who had no blood relation to me, for a full 6 years. But in this life, she took the initiative to get a paternity test. Her purpose in doing this wasn't to confirm the truth, but to use the test report as a weapon. This idea was given by Ilara. Ilara told her, Annie, didn't he say, I can let the matter of the child go? Who knows what he really means by that? What if he starts spreading rumors outside? You should get a test. If the child is his, take the report to him and confront him, look, the child is biologically yours. As the father, you're not even fighting for custody. Aren't you ashamed? Use this reason to force him to make concessions on the equity. Annie thought this idea was absolutely brilliant because she had a gamble in her heart, she was betting that the child was Julian's. Although the timeline of her relationship with Axel did overlap, she kept convincing herself, I was also with Julian during that period. Statistically speaking, the child should be Julian's. So, she took the child to the testing center. The staff told her that the results would be ready in 3 days. On the morning of October 23rd, Annie went alone to pick up the paternity test report. The testing center's lobby was heated, warm and cozy. She wore a beige trench coat and high heels, and with every step, the sound of her heels clicking on the tiled floor was particularly crisp. A staff member handed her a brown paper envelope through the window. She reached out to take it, and at that moment, her fingers didn't tremble in the slightest. It was clear that she was brimming with confidence about the result. She sat down on a plastic chair in the corner of the lobby, then eagerly tore open the envelope and pulled out the fateful piece of paper. Her eyes skipped directly over the information fields at the top and landed urgently on the final conclusion. As soon as she saw the words, excluded paternity, her pupils instantly contracted violently. Then, her gaze slowly moved upward, reading line by line with intense focus. With each line she read, her expression grew increasingly distraught, finally settling on the set of allele loci she couldn't understand at all. Those cold numbers were like a sharp knife, mercilessly declaring a fact she had been avoiding all along: the child was not Julian's. The report trembled slightly between her fingertips, not from the wind, but from her own uncontrollably shaking hands. She slowly closed the report, tucked it back into the envelope, and then sat motionless on the plastic chair for a full 15 minutes. The warm air from the vent above blew steadily, causing the stray hairs on her forehead to flutter. Her face was expressionless, but her nails dug deeply into the edge of the craft paper envelope, even piercing through the surface. At this moment, the paternity test report was no longer the weapon she had originally hoped for, but a bomb she had detonated with her own hands. She knew all too well that if Julian got his hands on this report, every possible escape route she had would be completely sealed off. This is not just a matter of equity. Legally, giving birth to a child out of wedlock during marriage constitutes fraud against one's spouse. Once divorce proceedings begin and property division takes place, the at-fault party can be required to receive a reduced share or even no share of the property. What's more, the words Julian once said, "I can let the matter of the child go," now carried a completely different weight. She suddenly realized that he had known the truth from the very beginning. He wasn't threatening her, he was letting her go. Yet, at the time, she foolishly believed it was just the angry words of a spineless man. When Annie walked out of the testing center, the sky had already turned overcast. Gray clouds hung low like a massive slab of lead, pressing down heavily. A cold wind, carrying a chill, seeped through the collar of her trench coat. She stood at the entrance, took out her phone, and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name, Julian. Her thumb hovered over the call button. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds passed, but she never pressed it. In the end, she slipped the phone back into her pocket, hailed a taxi, and silently headed home. On the same afternoon, at that familiar hot pot restaurant, still at our usual old spot, Charles handed me a USB drive. He pushed it toward me and said, "Everything's in there." I picked up the USB drive, turning it over and over in my hand. It felt light, but I knew what it contained was incredibly heavy. I asked him, "What did he say?" Charles began counting on his fingers. The first meeting was about discussing cooperation. Both sides were polite, and he even promised a 3-year exclusive partnership. The second time we met, he started asking about my relationship with you and inquired about what you've been up to lately. The third time, he laid his cards on the table, asking me to keep an eye on you for him, saying, "You help me watch Julian, and I'll take care of all the advertising agency matters from now on." I followed up, "And what about the fourth time?" Hearing my question, Charles's expression instantly changed. He looked at me, carefully choosing his words before saying, "The fourth time." He was drunk and became especially talkative. He said, "That company of Julian's will be mine sooner or later. His wife, well, now she should be called his ex-wife, has been with me for 4 years, and he still has no idea. That child isn't even his, yet he's been foolishly raising it for 6 years." By the time Charles finished speaking, his voice had grown somewhat hoarse. The hot pot bubbled in front of us, steam continuously rising, making my eyes sting a little, but it wasn't because of the steam. Recalling the events of those 4 and 6 years, in my past life, I had only pieced together these fragments of truth right before my death. But in this life, Axel himself had spoken these words aloud, and they had even been recorded. I clenched the USB drive tightly in my palm, squeezing it with all my strength. I said, "Charles." He responded, I added, "Thanks." Charles quickly shook his head, picked up his beer, and said, "Don't thank me. Just tell me when we're pulling the net." I replied, "Soon." With that, I slipped the USB drive into my jacket pocket and zipped it up. Currently, the chain of evidence is completely closed. The tax audit investigation results are the definitive proof of the dual contracts. There's the paternity test report that Annie herself had done, and there's the recording of Axel admitting to marital infidelity, the child not being his, and the plot to embezzle property. Plus, with the equity ownership confirmation application I submitted, every single clue was handed to me by them themselves. And I just saw it coming all along. October 28th, exactly 2 months since my rebirth. I specifically chose that coffee shop on the corner of West Street for the meeting because this was the very place where Annie and I signed the divorce agreement. I sat at the same old spot by the window, at the same table, with a faint coffee stain on the surface, a mark left by my cup 2 months ago. I arrived 20 minutes early, ordered an Americano, and sat quietly by the window, waiting. The sunlight slanted in, casting a beam across the table, splitting that coffee stain into light and shadow. 2 months ago, in this very seat, I watched Annie calmly say, "Let's get divorced," and then sign the papers without hesitation. Today, sitting in the same spot, 3 items lay on the table: a copy of a paternity test report, a USB drive, and a share acquisition agreement. Annie arrived first. When she pushed the door open and walked in, I immediately noticed she had lost a lot of weight. The lines of her cheeks were more sunken than they were 2 months ago, and beneath her eyes was a grayish-blue tint that even concealer couldn't fully cover. Her lips were dry and peeling, and it was clear she had hastily applied a layer of lipstick. She was wearing a black coat, completely different from the black dress she wore on the day we signed the divorce papers. That dress had been carefully chosen, carrying a sense of superiority like a judge, while today's coat was wrapped tightly around her, as if defending against something. She walked over and sat down across from me, her gaze falling on the 3 items on the table. It lingered for 3 seconds before quickly shifting away. She said, "You wanted to talk, so I came." Her voice was controlled and steady, but I still noticed her hands under the table, constantly twisting the hem of her coat. I said, "Waiting for someone." She asked, "Who?" As soon as the words fell, the door of the cafe opened again, and it was Axel who entered. He stood at the doorway, scanned the shop, saw Annie and me, then noticed the items on the table. His steps visibly paused for a moment before he slowly walked in. He sat next to Annie, but unlike before, he didn't wrap his arm around her waist. His hands were tucked into his coat pockets, and he leaned back in the chair. On the surface, his posture seemed relaxed, but his jawline was tightly clenched. He spoke first, his voice slightly hoarse from days of dealing with the tax authorities, his throat strained from shouting, "Julian, if you want to talk, let's talk straightforwardly. Don't play these meaningless games." I took a sip of my Americano, set the cup down, and said, "First." I pushed the paternity test report to the center of the table. "This, you did it yourself." I looked at Annie. She sat there motionless, but her throat, or more precisely, her larynx, clearly moved as she swallowed. I continued, "The conclusion of the test is exclusion of paternity. The child isn't mine. During our marriage, you," my gaze shifted to Axel, "had this child with him." Axel's lips instantly pressed into a tight line. He didn't speak because he had no idea Annie had gone for the test. He turned his head to glance at Annie, but she wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the report as if she were frozen in place. The second piece of evidence. I placed the USB drive next to the report. "This is the recording of your meetings with Charles, 4 times in total. You said it yourself, you and Annie have been together for 4 years, the child isn't mine, and you plotted to take over my company. Every word is clearly recorded in here." Hearing this, Axel's body instantly stiffened. This stiffness wasn't feigned, his shoulders involuntarily rose by a centimeter, and the hand in his coat pocket clenched into a fist, the outline of his knuckles pressing sharply against the fabric. He gritted out a few words through his teeth, "Charles." I quickly explained, "He didn't betray you because he was never on your side to begin with." Axel's breathing grew heavy, his nostrils flaring twice. I continued, "The third item." I pushed the equity acquisition agreement toward him. "Your company, Hengchang Trading, due to the issue of dual contracts, the tax audit has issued a preliminary conclusion, tax evasion of 8.6 million, plus late fees and penalties, totaling around 14 million. And you don't have that kind of money in your accounts." I looked at him and went on, 3 days ago, Binhai Real Estate terminated all cooperation with you and is already pursuing legal action for compensation. Your bank loan is due next month, and there's no way to renew it. For suppliers have already sent demand letters." I flipped the agreement to the last page and pointed to the signature line. "Christopher is willing to acquire the core assets of Hengchang Trading, the warehouse base and customer channels, for 10 million. That's already a 30% discount on the market price, but given your situation, it's the best offer you're going to get." I placed the pen next to the agreement. "Sign it, and you'll still have some money left to hire a lawyer for the legal battles. Don't sign, and by next month, you'll be insolvent, entering bankruptcy liquidation. At that point, you won't get a single cent." For a moment, the cafe fell silent for about 10 seconds. The background music in the cafe played a soothing jazz tune, with the deep bass line flowing gently through the air, yet compared to the tense atmosphere among the 3 people at the table, it felt utterly absurd. The first to erupt was Axel. He pushed the table forcefully with both hands, causing it to shake violently. The coffee cups jumped, spilling their contents and soaking a corner of the paternity test report. He stood up, his chair toppling to the floor behind him, and roared, "You set me up. Was it you who did the tax thing?" Just as he lunged forward, two men in black jackets rose from the neighboring table. This wasn't my arrangement, it was Christopher's. Christopher had said, "When you're dealing with that kind of person, you can't be alone." The two men positioned themselves on either side of Axel, standing so close that he could clearly smell the cigarette smoke on them, though they didn't touch him. Axel's movement froze mid-air. His chest heaved violently, and the veins on his forehead bulged like earthworms. His voice trembled, not out of fear, but from fury pushed to its limit with nowhere to vent. "Julian, you think you've won? You think you're clean? You." I said, "Sit down." Just those two words, spoken softly, but Axel's Adam's apple bobbed, and he slowly sank back into his seat. Someone from the next table helped right the chair. I said, "Sign it. You're out of time." Axel hung his head, both hands braced on the edge of the table, his 10 fingers clenched so tightly they turned white. His breathing was heavy, as if each exhale was a struggle to convince himself not to flip the table over. 30 seconds later, he finally picked up the pen. As the tip touched the paper, his hand visibly trembled, and the signature he wrote was crooked, each stroke looking as if it had been carved into the page. After signing, he slammed the pen heavily onto the table, stood up, and walked away without looking back. He pushed open the cafe door, and a gust of cold wind instantly rushed in, making the menu board rattle noisily. After the door closed, the shop fell quiet again. Only Annie and I remained at the table. She hadn't said a word the entire time, her hands resting on her knees, her nails digging deeply into the fabric of her coat. The lipstick on her face looked overly bright under the lights, creating a stark contrast with her ashen complexion. I asked her, "Is there anything else you want to say?" She looked up, her eyes red but without shedding a tear. Her voice was so soft it was almost drowned out by the background music. "When did you start planning this?" I look at her, at this face I've loved for 2 lifetimes. In my previous life, lying on the ICU bed, the last thing I thought of was this face. Back then, I couldn't even muster hatred anymore, all that remained was resentment and confusion. Why did giving everything lead to such an ending? Now, I finally understand. I stand up and say, "From the second you said, 'Let's get divorced.'" I gather the copy of the agreement that belongs to me from the table, slip the USB drive into my pocket, and leave the paternity test report on the table. It's a copy, she has the original herself. As I reach the door, a voice comes from behind me, so faint it seems squeezed from the depths of her throat, "Julian." My footsteps pause for a second. She continues, "I was wrong." Her voice is utterly shattered, not in the way of a wailing cry, but as if each syllable is cracking apart, like stepping on thin ice, every step collapsing. "You lied to me, you deceived me, you made me think you were still the same as before." She didn't finish speaking because she couldn't go on, her shoulders trembling violently, her breathing coming in gasps. The coffee cup in front of her had tipped over, liquid trickling down the edge of the table, dripping one by one onto her coat, but she made no move to wipe it away. I stood at the door, my hand on the handle, the glass reflecting the cafe lights and my own face. I knew that if it were the me from my past life, I would have turned back, would have rushed back, held her, and said, "It's okay, I forgive you," then continued being that good-natured pushover trampled underfoot. But the me from my past life was already dead, having died in the white light of the hospital corridor, in the final long beep of the heart monitor. I pushed the door open and walked out, the door closing behind me. Through the glass, I saw her bury her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I turned around and walked resolutely into the wind of late October, without looking back. On November 15th, Xingyuan Building Materials was officially renamed Xingyuan Industrial. The unveiling ceremony was modest, held on the steps in front of the company, where the new sign was hung. Christopher arrived, holding a bouquet of flowers, and said a bit sheepishly, "I'm not very good at choosing, so I just picked something at random." Charles also came, wearing a brand new shirt with the top button fastened all the way up. I said to him, "You should undo the top button, it looks too tight." But he replied seriously, "No, today is a formal occasion." Then he stood next to me, took a photo of the new sign, and posted it on his social media with the caption, "My buddy's opening, had to be here." Christopher glanced at Charles's post and said with a smile, "This friend of yours is truly genuine." I said, "More down-to-earth than me." Christopher didn't respond to my comment, just patted me on the shoulder and said, "All right, call me if you need anything." Then he left. Charles muttered beside me, "The way Christopher talked to you sounded like he was giving last words." I said, "That's called trust." He scratched his head and said, "Oh, so he trusts you." After the unveiling ceremony, I returned to the office alone and sat for a while. The smell of the new renovation in the office hadn't completely dissipated yet. I opened the window to let the breeze in. At that moment, I noticed several unread messages on my phone screen. The first one was from the lawyer: "The judgment on the confirmation of equity ownership has been issued. The court ruled that the equity of the Xingyuan building materials belongs to your premarital personal property. The company was registered before marriage, and the appreciation during the marriage has already been agreed upon in the divorce settlement. Annie's claim has been dismissed." The second one was from Christopher: "The handover of Hengchang trading storage base and customer channels has been completed. The new urban district project you mentioned last time can be launched next week." The third message was from an unfamiliar number, containing no text, only a photo. The photo showed a very narrow alley, flanked by old residential buildings with walls covered in dense, spiderweb-like electrical wires. At the end of the alley, there was a clothesline with a few children's clothes hanging on it. The photo's location tag indicated it was taken in Qingnan Village, a place I recognized. Qingnan Village was the worst part of the urban village, 2 levels below the rental I used to live in. It seemed Annie had moved there. In my previous life, after she and Axel took over my company, they moved into a riverside apartment. But in this life, Axel's company was acquired, his assets were frozen, and the case involving the shady contracts was still under investigation. Annie's job was affected when rumors about her private lifestyle issues spread at her company, and she resigned voluntarily last month. I didn't know who sent this photo. It could have been Annie herself, or perhaps Alara or Nix. But those two had long since cut ties with Annie, as they understood better than anyone that people tend to kick someone when they're down. I looked at the photo for 3 seconds, then deleted it. At 4 in the afternoon, I locked the office door and went downstairs. The new company was located in an office building in the eastern part of the city, on the 12th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood downstairs, looked up at the glass curtain wall, and the November sunlight shone on the glass, reflecting a blinding white light. Just then, my phone rang again. The caller ID showed an unregistered number, but I recognized it. It was the new number Annie had changed to last month. I stared at the string of digits on the screen. It lit up for 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7 seconds, and then I pressed the hang-up button. The screen went dark. I put my phone back in my pocket, stood still, and looked up. Reflected on the glass curtain wall were the sky, the clouds, and the silhouette of a man in a dark coat. Memories from my past life surged up one last time like a tide: the white light in the hospital corridor, the beeping of the heart monitor, and then a sharp, piercing, drawn-out sound: beep. That sound seemed to come from behind my temples, like a needle piercing my brain. I closed my eyes and clenched my teeth tightly. 3 seconds later, the sound finally stopped, as if a door had been shut forever. I opened my eyes, the throbbing in my temples was gone. Those scenes from my past life, the version of me kneeling in the hallway, the one drenched in the rain, the one lying on a hospital bed listening to the endless beep of the heart monitor, all faded into gray, like an old photograph gently blown away by the wind. I took a deep breath. The air carried the chill of November, the faint lingering scent of osmanthus from the flower bed at the entrance of the office building, and the dusty smell stirred up by passing cars on the road. Each scent was new. This was the smell of being alive. I lowered my head, zipped up my jacket, and stepped into the flow of pedestrians on the sidewalk. Behind me, the sunlight still shone brightly on the glass curtain wall, but this time, it was shining on me.